At the base of the Bighorn Mountains, where the prairie met the foothills, a Scottish widow was building her cabin in a place no sensible homesteader would consider. While everyone else claimed flat ground with good drainage and easy access, she had filed her claim on a rocky hillside dominated by a limestone overhang that locals called the Bear's Mouth, a shallow cave that cut 30 feet into the cliff face and rose 15 feet at its highest point. They called her the Cave Woman. They called her the Hermit. They called her mad with grief. While everyone else raised cabins in the open where the sun could reach them and the wind could dry the laundry, she was building her walls inside the rock itself, tucking her home beneath a stone ceiling that had stood for 10,000 years. Her neighbors gathered at the trading post in Buffalo to discuss her foolishness with the patient, contempt reserved for those who would learn their lesson soon enough. The local rancher, a man named Crawford who ran 3,000 head of cattle across the foothills, said she was building a tomb for herself. The other homesteaders' wives whispered that losing her husband to the winter 2 years past had broken something inside her, that she was crawling into the earth to join him, rather than facing life on the open prairie. They couldn't understand why any sensible woman would choose darkness over light, stone over sky, a cave over a proper cabin that stood proud under the Wyoming sun. But that fool woman's cave dwelling, the one they said would be damp and dark and miserable, it would become the only shelter for miles when the worst storm in territorial history descended on the Bighorn foothills. And the neighbors who had mocked her would come crawling through the snow, begging for the refuge they had ridiculed. What did she understand about thermal mass, wind protection, and the ancient wisdom of stone shelter that made her choice the difference between survival and death when the sky turned white and the temperature dropped beyond measurement? The widow's name was Aileen McLeod. She had come to Wyoming Territory with her husband Hamish in the spring of 1883, driven west by the promise of cheap land and open range. Hamish had been a stonemason in Aberdeen before the work dried up, a man who understood rock the way other men understood wood or soil. He could look at a cliff face and see the layers of time compressed into stone, read the history of water and wind and pressure that had shaped the land over millennia. He had seen the Bear's Mouth Cave during their first summer in the territory, when they were still living in a canvas tent and searching for the right place to build. Most settlers passed the limestone overhang without a second glance. It faced north. It was hard to reach, and it offered nothing but shadow when the land all around it lay bright with sunshine. But Hamish had stopped his horse and stared at that dark opening for a full 10 minutes without speaking. "That's where we'll build," he had said finally. "That's where we'll live." Aileen had learned not to question her husband's judgment about stone. He saw things in rock that others couldn't see, understood properties that went beyond what the eye could measure. When he explained his reasoning that night by their campfire, she began to understand what had captured his attention. The cave faced north, true, but that meant the summer sun would never beat directly into their living space, keeping the interior cool during the brutal July heat that drove other settlers to desperation. The limestone overhang extended 40 feet beyond the cliff face, creating a natural roof that would shed rain and snow without any construction required. The rock walls, 15 feet thick in places, would hold temperature steady regardless of what happened outside. Cool in summer, warm in winter, stable when the weather swung wildly between extremes. Most importantly, the thermal mass of all that stone would act as a giant buffer against temperature change. While wooden cabins heated up within hours of a summer day and froze within hours of a winter night, the cave would take weeks to respond to outside conditions. The temperature inside would stay nearly constant year-round, hovering around 55 degrees, regardless of whether the air outside was hot enough to kill or cold enough to freeze a man solid. And the location, hard against the mountain's face, would be protected from the winds that screamed across the open prairie during winter storms, while other cabins would shake and rattle and leak cold air through every gap. A home built into the cave would sit in perfect stillness, sheltered by 1,000,000 tons of stone. Hamish had begun the construction that same autumn, working with the stone rather than against it. He didn't try to build a freestanding cabin inside the cave. Instead, he used the cave itself as 3 walls of his home, constructing only a front wall to enclose the space. That front wall rose 12 feet high and stretched 24 feet wide, built from limestone blocks he cut from a quarry site half a mile up the mountain. The blocks were massive. Some weighed 300 pounds, and fitting them required the skills he had learned during 20 years of masonry work in Scotland. The wall was 2 feet thick, with a door in the center and 2 windows on either side. The windows were small, 18 inches square, to minimize heat loss while still admitting light. The door was heavy oak planking, hung on iron hinges that Hamish had forged himself, fitted tight enough to block the drafts that plagued every other cabin in the territory. He had completed the wall and begun work on the interior when the winter of 1884 arrived early and hard. A November blizzard caught him checking his horse lines a quarter-mile from the cave, and by the time Aileen found him, the cold had taken too much. He died 3 days later, leaving her with an unfinished home and a grief that felt like stone pressing on her chest. She had considered leaving, going back to Scotland, or east to Chicago, or anywhere that didn't remind her of the man who had seen a home in a hole in the rock. But something held her to this place, the work he had started, the vision he had shared, the understanding that the cave had been his gift to her, even if he hadn't lived to see it finished. She would complete what he had begun. She would live in the home he had designed, and she would prove that his judgment about stone had been sound, even if no one else in the territory could see it. The interior work took her 2 full years, laboring alone with occasional help from a crow woman named Bird That Walks, who lived in the foothills and understood the value of what Aileen was building. The cave floor was uneven limestone that needed leveling before any furniture could sit stable. Aileen hauled sand and gravel from a creek bed 2 miles away, spreading layer after layer until she had created a flat surface that she covered with wooden planking salvaged from shipping crates. The walls required different treatment depending on their nature. The limestone surfaces were naturally dry, but rough enough to catch clothing and scrape skin. Aileen smoothed the worst areas with a mason's rasp, then whitewashed the entire interior with lime paste that brightened the space and sealed the stone against moisture. The front wall, Hamish's masterwork of fitted blocks, she left natural. The gray limestone had a beauty that paint would only diminish. Furnishing the cave home demanded creativity that a conventional cabin would never require. Standard furniture sat crooked on floors that still undulated despite her leveling efforts. Aileen learned to build her own pieces, crafting a bed frame with adjustable legs, a table that could be shimmed level, chairs with bases that accommodated the rock beneath the planking. Her cook stove, a cast-iron monster that had cost her 3 months of savings, sat on a platform she constructed specifically to position the flue pipe where it could exit through a natural crack in the cave's ceiling. That crack was one of the features Hamish had identified during his initial examination of the site. It ran from the cave's interior up through 30 feet of solid rock, emerging on the hillside above like a natural chimney. The draft it created was perfect for a wood stove, strong enough to pull smoke upward, even when the wind outside blew from the wrong direction, but not so strong that it sucked heat out of the living space. Other settlers struggled with smoking cabins and backdrafts and flues that wouldn't draw. Aileen's stove worked flawlessly from the first fire she lit. By the autumn of 1886, the cave home was complete. From the outside, visitors saw only Hamish's stone wall set into the cliff face. A strange sight, certainly, but solid and permanent in a way that the wooden shacks scattered across the prairie could never match. From the inside, Aileen lived in a space that maintained a steady 55 degrees, regardless of whether the outside temperature read 100 above or 30 below. Her water supply came from a spring that emerged from the rock at the back of the cave, filtered through limestone for centuries until it ran cleaner than any well water in the territory. Her food stores sat in a natural cold room where the temperature never rose above 40 degrees, keeping meat fresh for weeks without salt or smoking. The neighbors who came to see her strange dwelling left shaking their heads. The interior was comfortable enough, they admitted. Dry, spacious, warmer than they had expected. But it was still a cave, still a hole in the rock where a proper woman had no business living. Crawford's wife had offered to help Aileen find a real homestead, somewhere with a cabin that had 4 walls and a roof like God intended. Aileen had thanked her politely and declined. She knew what she had. She knew what Hamish had seen, and when the test came, she would be ready. The test came in January of 1887. The morning of January 8th began clear and cold, with temperatures around 0 and a light wind from the northwest. Aileen checked her horse in the small stable she had built against the cliff face, fed her chickens in their coop tucked into a secondary overhang, and settled into her cave home to work on the quilt she was piecing from fabric scraps. The weather seemed stable, typical for midwinter in the Bighorn foothills. By noon, the sky had begun to change. A wall of clouds appeared on the northern horizon, darker and more solid than any weather front Aileen had seen in 3 years on the territory. The wind picked up, shifting from northwest to due north, carrying a cold that cut through her coat like the cloth wasn't there. By 2 o'clock, the first snow had begun to fall. Not gentle flakes drifting down from above, but horizontal sheets of ice driven by wind that had already risen to a scream. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees in 2 hours and was still falling. By 4 o'clock, the world had disappeared. Aileen stood at her heavy oak door and looked out at nothing. The white was absolute, not snow falling, but snow flying, swirling, filling the air so completely that she couldn't see her hand when she extended it past the door frame. The wind had become a physical force, a pressure that pushed against her body and roared in her ears like a river in flood. The cold was beyond anything she had experienced, beyond anything she had imagined possible. The thermometer that hung beside her door had stopped reading accurately somewhere below -30. Its mercury contracted into a ball that refused to move any lower. The sound alone was terrifying. A constant shriek that rose and fell but never stopped, punctuated by deeper groans as the wind found gaps in the landscape and howled through them like a living thing in pain. Aileen had experienced Scottish winters, had known cold that most Americans would find unbearable. But this was different. This was cold as a weapon, cold as an enemy, cold that wanted to kill everything it touched and had the power to do exactly that. She closed the door and latched it. The wind noise dropped to a distant moan, filtered through 2 feet of solid limestone. The temperature inside the cave held steady at 54 degrees, the massive rock walls absorbing the cold from outside so slowly that it would take weeks of this weather to drop the interior temperature by even a few degrees. The contrast was so stark that it felt like stepping between two different worlds, the world outside where death ruled, and the world inside where life could continue. Aileen lit her stove, put water on to boil, and waited. The first refugee arrived 6 hours later. The pounding on her door came just after 10 o'clock, barely audible over the wind's howl. Aileen grabbed her lantern and opened the heavy oak planking to find a figure so covered in snow and ice that she couldn't identify it as human until it moved. Crawford's youngest son, a boy of 16 named Thomas, collapsed across her threshold with frost already forming on his cheeks, and his fingers frozen into claws around the rope he had used to guide himself along the fence line that led from the Crawford ranch toward the mountains. He had been in the barn when the storm hit, separated from the main house by 200 yards that had become impassable within minutes. Rather than wait in the unheated barn where the temperature was already dropping toward zero, he had remembered the cave woman's strange dwelling and set out following fence lines that eventually brought him to the base of the cliff. The journey of 3 miles had taken him 5 hours. He had fallen through a drift that buried him to the chest and spent 20 minutes digging himself out. He had lost feeling in his feet somewhere around the 2nd mile and in his hands shortly after. He had been ready to lie down in the snow and let the cold take him when he saw the faint glow of lantern light through Aileen's window. She brought him inside, stripped off his frozen clothing, wrapped him in quilts warmed by the stove, and began the slow process of bringing his body temperature back to normal. His fingers and toes had the waxy whiteness of serious frostbite, but the flesh was still soft beneath the surface. Frozen superficially, not deeply. He would keep all his digits if the warming went slowly enough. The second group arrived at midnight. Crawford himself, his wife, and their 2 daughters, all of them frost-damaged and exhausted after a journey that should have taken 30 minutes but had stretched to nearly 4 hours. They had followed young Thomas's footprints until the wind erased them, then navigated by the cliff face itself, keeping the rock wall on their right until they reached the limestone overhang that marked Aileen's home. Crawford could barely speak through lips cracked and bleeding from the cold. His wife was in worse shape, her fingers frozen so badly that Aileen worried she would lose several of them. The daughters, bundled in every piece of clothing the family owned, had survived in better condition than their parents only because their mother had given them her own mittens during the worst of the journey. By dawn, Aileen's cave held 11 people: the Crawford family, a bachelor homesteader named Jensen, who had nearly died trying to reach his own cabin before the wind turned him around, a young couple named Wheeler, who had been traveling to Buffalo when the storm caught them on the open road, and a Crow family of 3 who had been Bird That Walks' neighbors before the cold drove them to seek shelter in stone. The cave that had seemed strange and cramped to visitors during fair weather now revealed its true value. The interior temperature held steady at 52 degrees despite the door opening repeatedly to admit refugees. The spring at the back of the cave provided unlimited fresh water. The food stores that Aileen had accumulated, dried meat, preserved vegetables, sacks of flour and beans, proved sufficient to feed 11 people for the 3 days that the storm raged without pause. And the storm did rage. For 72 hours, the wind screamed across the Wyoming prairie with temperatures that dropped to 45 below zero in sheltered locations and 70 below or worse in the wind chill of open ground. Snow accumulated in drifts that buried buildings to their roof lines. Cattle died by the thousands across the territory, frozen standing in fields they couldn't escape. Horses died in barns that offered no protection against cold, that found every crack and gap in wooden construction. The Crawford Ranch house, which the family had fled when the walls began letting in visible streams of snow through gaps that had seemed insignificant, would be found half buried when the storm finally ended. The interior temperature when they finally returned would be measured at 22 below zero, cold enough to freeze the water in the kitchen pump and crack the cast iron of the cook stove. Jensen's cabin had simply vanished, buried under a drift that deposited snow 40 feet deep in the gully where he had unwisely built. He wouldn't find the structure until spring, and then only because his chimney pipe poked up through the melting snow like a marker for a grave. The Wheeler couple's wagon and horses were never found at all. The animals had bolted when the wind hit, and the snow had swallowed them somewhere on the open prairie. The supplies the couple had been transporting, a winter's worth of goods for a trading post in Buffalo, were scattered across 10 square miles of drifted snow, most of it ruined beyond salvage. But in the cave, 11 people lived in something approaching comfort. The temperature never dropped below 50 degrees. The fire burned steady with wood that Aileen had stacked against the cliff face the previous autumn, protected from the weather by another limestone overhang. Food was plain but sufficient. Beans and biscuits, dried elk meat, preserved squash from Aileen's garden. Water flowed cold and clean from the spring that had been filtering through rock since before humans walked this continent. On the second night, when the wind rose to a pitch that seemed impossible, and the cold outside reached depths that the refugees couldn't comprehend, Crawford finally spoke the words that none of them had been willing to say. "You saved us," he said to Aileen. "This cave that we mocked, it saved us all." Aileen poured him another cup of coffee brewed from the beans she had been saving for a special occasion. "My husband saved you," she said. "He saw what this place could be. I just finished what he started." Crawford shook his head. "We laughed at you. We called you crazy. We said you were building a tomb. And now?" Crawford looked around the cave, at his family, alive and warm, at the strangers who had found refuge in the same stone shelter, at the walls that held steady while the world outside tried to kill everything that lived. His wife sat by the fire, her bandaged hands cradled in her lap, tears running down her cheeks, not from pain, but from relief that her children were safe. His son, Thomas, whose frozen fingers had recovered enough feeling to hold a cup of coffee, sat wrapped in quilts that smelled of cedar and wood smoke. His daughter slept on a bed of blankets Aileen had made up in the corner, exhausted but alive. "Now I say you're the smartest woman in Wyoming territory, and I say your husband was a man who understood things the rest of us are too foolish to see." The storm ended on the morning of January 11th. The refugees emerged from the cave into a world transformed, white and still and silent, every familiar landmark buried or altered beyond recognition. The cold had moderated to a mere 20 below zero, practically warm after what they had survived. Crawford's ranch had lost 400 head of cattle, nearly half his herd. Jensen had lost everything: his cabin, his supplies, his livestock, his hope of proving up his claim. The Wheelers had lost their wagon, their horses, their goods, and very nearly their lives. Across the territory, the toll would eventually be calculated in the tens of thousands of dead cattle and the hundreds of homesteaders who would abandon their claims rather than start over after such devastation. But 11 people had lived. 11 people had stayed warm and fed and safe, while the worst storm in territorial history raged outside. And they had survived because one woman had refused to listen when her neighbors told her that living in a cave was foolish. Aileen McLeod stayed in her cave home for another 28 years, until her death in the winter of 1915 at the age of 71. By then, 3 other families in the foothills had constructed similar dwellings, cutting into cliff faces to create homes that could withstand any weather the Wyoming mountains could produce. The technique spread slowly. Most settlers still preferred conventional construction, despite the evidence that stone shelter outperformed wooden cabins in every measurable way. But those who remembered the storm of 1887 never forgot the lesson it had taught. And when they told their children about the 3 days when the cold tried to kill everything that lived, they always mentioned the cave woman who had seen what others couldn't see, who had built what others thought was foolish, and who had opened her door when the neighbors who had mocked her came begging for the shelter they had ridiculed. Some lessons take a long time to learn. Some people never learn them at all. But the stone knows. The stone always knows, and it shelters those who are wise enough to ask. Hamish had known. He had seen it in the rock before he ever laid a single block. Aileen had trusted him, and 28 years later, she was still warm, still dry, still alive in the home that everyone said would be her tomb. It wasn't a tomb. It was a sanctuary, and the mountain had been waiting 10,000 years for someone wise enough to see it.